Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the History AI podcast. I'm Chuck, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Marco. How's it going, Marco?
I'm doing well, Chuck. Ready to dive into another dark but important chapter of history. This one's going to be heavy, so listeners, grab a coffee, maybe a box of tissues, and let's dive in.
Yeah, today we're talking about the Rhineland Massacres of 1096. This is one of those episodes where history slaps you in the face and says, yep, humans can be pretty awful.
Absolutely. It's tied to the First Crusade and serves as a grim reminder of what happens when fear, hatred, and religious zealotry spiral out of control. So, buckle up folks, this is a tough but necessary story.
Alright Marco, let's set the scene. It's the late 11th century in Europe. We're smack dab in the High Middle Ages, where religion isn't just a part of life, it is life. Every aspect of society is influenced by the church, from laws to daily routines, and the line between faith and politics is pretty much non-existent.
Exactly. Christianity was the dominant religion in Western Europe, and the Catholic Church wielded immense power. But at the same time, Europe was far from united. It was a patchwork of feudal kingdoms, each ruled by nobles who were constantly squabbling over land and resources. Against this backdrop, you have the rise of Islam in the Middle East and North Africa. By the late 11th century, Muslim rulers controlled Jerusalem and much of the Holy Land, a fact that didn't sit well with many Christians.
Which brings us to Pope Urban II. In 1095, he made one of the most consequential speeches in history at the Council of Clermont in France. He called for a crusade, urging Christian knights to take up arms and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control.
And let's be clear, this wasn't just a pious call to arms. Urban promised that anyone who joined the crusade would receive a plenary indulgence. Basically, a free pass to skip purgatory and go straight to heaven. For knights and warriors who had spent their lives steeped in violence, this was an appealing offer.
Absolutely. But Urban's speech didn't just reach the ears of trained knights and seasoned soldiers. It also ignited a fervor among the common people, peasants, tradesmen, and anyone with a vague understanding of what the Holy Land even was.
And that's how we get the so-called People's Crusade. Unlike the official Crusader armies, which were organized and led by European nobles, the People's Crusade was a chaotic movement. It was spearheaded by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit, who roamed from village to village stirring up religious zeal.
Picture it, townsfolk who'd probably never traveled more than a few miles from home suddenly packing their belongings, grabbing whatever weapons they could find, and joining this holy pilgrimage. They weren't trained soldiers, they were farmers with pitchforks and cooks with butcher knives.
And while the main goal of the crusade was to march to Jerusalem, this untrained and unruly mob began looking for enemies of Christianity closer to home. And here's where things take a very dark turn.
Right. At the time, Europe was home to thriving Jewish communities, especially in the Rhineland, an area encompassing modern-day Western Germany. Cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz were major centers of Jewish life, with communities that had lived there for centuries.
These Jewish communities were deeply integrated into local economies and culture. They were scholars, merchants, moneylenders, and artisans. But they also lived as minorities under Christian rule, which meant they were often subject to restrictive laws and heavy taxes.
And let's not forget the backdrop of antisemitism that had been building for centuries. By 1096, many Christians in Europe viewed Jews with suspicion and outright hostility. They were scapegoated for everything from bad harvests to plagues, and accusations like blood libel, false claims that Jews used the blood of Christian children in rituals, were already circulating.
So, when these groups of zealous, untrained crusaders started marching through the Rhineland, they saw the Jewish communities not as neighbors but as enemies of their faith. In their minds, attacking Jewish people was a way to purify their mission before even reaching the Holy Land.
This is where the stage was set for the Rhineland Massacres. A combination of religious fervor, antisemitism, and mob mentality created a powder keg. And when the People's Crusade passed through these cities, the spark was lit.
It's tragic because these massacres weren't part of the official crusade plans. They were the actions of uncontrolled mobs who distorted the idea of a holy mission into an excuse for slaughter.
And yet, they became an indelible part of the First Crusade's legacy.
So, in the spring of 1096, the People's Crusade began moving through the Rhineland, and with them came a wave of violence against Jewish communities. The first major attack took place in Speyer, and it was only the beginning of what would become a widespread campaign of terror.
Speyer was a relatively small Jewish community but a significant one. On May 3, 1096, a group of crusaders entered the city. These weren't professional soldiers, they were fanatical peasants and low-ranking knights fueled by religious zeal and the promise of divine reward.
Their demands were straightforward but horrifying. They insisted the Jewish population convert to Christianity on the spot. For the Jewish community, this wasn't just a matter of survival, it was a direct assault on their faith and identity. Conversion wasn't something they could accept.
The Jews of Speyer resisted, and the Crusaders responded with violence. They began killing anyone who refused to convert. Homes were looted, families were torn apart, and a small massacre unfolded.
Here's an important detail: the local bishop of Speyer actually tried to intervene. Bishop John of Speyer sheltered some Jewish families in his palace and attempted to stop the Crusaders from escalating the violence. His efforts saved some lives, but he couldn't protect everyone. By the time the violence subsided, at least 11 Jews were murdered, a small number compared to what would come next, but devastating for the community.
From Speyer, the Crusaders moved on to Worms, where the Jewish population was much larger. In this time, the violence reached a horrifying scale.
Worms had a prominent Jewish quarter, and when the Crusaders arrived, they demanded the same as in Speyer: immediate conversion or death. The Jewish community tried to seek refuge in their homes, but the Crusaders were relentless.
The situation escalated when rumors began to spread that the Jews of Worms had desecrated a Christian holy relic. This baseless accusation inflamed the mob even further. Over the course of a week, the Crusaders stormed the Jewish quarter, dragging people from their homes and murdering them in the streets.
Many Jewish families sought refuge in the bishop's palace, hoping for protection. But unlike in Speyer, the local authorities in Worms were unable, or unwilling, to stand against the Crusaders. The mob broke into the palace and massacred those inside.
This is where we see a tragic and recurring theme. Many Jews, faced with the unbearable choice of conversion or death, chose a third option: suicide. Entire families took their own lives rather than renounce their faith or be killed by the mob.
By the time the Crusaders moved on, the Jewish community of Worms was almost completely annihilated. Contemporary accounts estimate that as many as 800 Jews were murdered in Worms alone.
And then came Mainz, the largest and most significant Jewish community in the Rhineland. This city was a major center of Jewish scholarship and culture, a thriving hub of trade and learning.
When word reached Mainz that the Crusaders were approaching, the Jewish community knew they were in grave danger. They turned to the Archbishop of Mainz for protection, offering him a large sum of money in exchange for shelter.
The Archbishop initially agreed and allowed the Jews to take refuge in his fortified palace. But when the Crusaders arrived, they were in such overwhelming numbers that the Archbishop's forces either couldn't or wouldn't hold them back.
What followed was one of the most brutal massacres of the entire campaign. On May 27, 1096, the Crusaders stormed the palace and slaughtered the Jews who had taken refuge there.
The scale of violence in Mainz was staggering. Some historical accounts suggest that up to 1,200 Jews were killed in a single day. And, just like in Worms, many Jews chose to take their own lives rather than face the Crusaders. There are accounts of parents killing their children to spare them from torture or forced conversion, a heart-wrenching testament to their resolve and faith.
By the time the Crusaders left Mainz, the Jewish community there had been completely wiped out. And the pattern continued as they marched through the Rhineland, targeting other Jewish communities in towns like Cologne, Trier, and Metz.
It's worth noting that not all Christians in these cities supported the massacres. In some cases, local bishops and citizens tried to protect their Jewish neighbors, but their efforts were often overwhelmed by the sheer size and ferocity of the Crusader mobs.
The Rhineland Massacres weren't just random acts of violence, they were systematic and deliberate. The Crusaders saw themselves as cleansing Christendom of infidels, starting with the Jewish communities right in their own backyard.
It's chilling to think that these massacres were just the beginning. The People's Crusade was eventually wiped out before it even reached the Holy Land, but the official crusades that followed brought their own horrors.
The Rhineland Massacres are an early and horrifying example of how religious fanaticism and antisemitism can combine to create unthinkable atrocities. They mark one of the darkest chapters in the history of Jewish-Christian relations in Europe.
It's easy to look at the Rhineland Massacres and point to the chaos of the People's Crusade as the main cause. But to really understand why this happened, we have to dig deeper. These massacres didn't come out of nowhere, they were the product of centuries of social, religious, and economic pressures.
Let's start with antisemitism. By the late 11th century, negative stereotypes about Jewish people were deeply ingrained in European society. The Church, which was the dominant institution at the time, had long painted Jews as outsiders, even enemies, within Christendom.
One of the key narratives was the idea that Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. This belief wasn't just theological, it became a justification for ostracizing and persecuting Jewish communities. Church sermons often reinforced this narrative, fueling resentment and distrust.
Another factor was the way Jewish communities were economically positioned. At the time, Christians were forbidden by church law from lending money with interest, something called usury. However, Jews weren't bound by this restriction, which made them essential as moneylenders in medieval economies.
On paper, that might sound like a lucrative role, but it came with enormous risks. Lending money to Christian nobles and merchants made Jews a convenient scapegoat whenever debts piled up or economies faltered. If a noble couldn't, or didn't want to, pay back a debt, it was easier to demonize the Jewish lender than to honor the obligation.
This economic role made Jewish communities targets of envy and resentment, especially in times of hardship. And when Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, many crusaders saw an opportunity to erase their debts through violence, all while cloaking it in religious fervor.
Speaking of religious fervor, the theological justification for these massacres also played a big role. When Pope Urban II called for the Crusade in 1095, he framed it as a battle against the infidels, the Muslims who controlled Jerusalem and the Holy Land. But many crusaders interpreted infidels more broadly, including Jewish people in Europe.
Here's where we see some twisted logic at work. Some crusaders argued, why travel thousands of miles to fight non-Christians in the Holy Land when there are non-Christians living right here among us? To them, attacking Jewish communities was a way to purify Europe before heading to Jerusalem.
It's important to note that this wasn't part of the Pope's official call to arms. The Church wasn't explicitly targeting Jewish communities. But the inflammatory rhetoric of the time created an environment where mobs felt justified in doing so.
And then there's the role of mob mentality. The People's Crusade wasn't made up of disciplined soldiers, it was an unruly mix of peasants, low-ranking knights, and religious zealots. Many of these people had little understanding of the complexities of the Crusade's mission. What they did have was desperation, fear, and a lot of pent-up anger.
Desperation is a key word here. Life in medieval Europe was harsh, famines, disease, and constant warfare left people struggling to survive. The Crusades offered a promise of salvation and glory, but they also provided an outlet for rage and frustration. For some, that rage was directed at Jewish communities, who were seen as convenient and vulnerable targets.
There's also a psychological aspect to consider. The Crusaders believed they were embarking on a holy mission, and violence became a way to prove their piety. By attacking Jewish communities, they convinced themselves they were defending Christianity and earning divine favor, even if their actions were blatantly cruel and unjust.
Let's not forget the lack of strong centralized authority. Many local rulers and bishops tried to protect Jewish communities, but they often didn't have the resources or manpower to stand up to large mobs of crusaders. The fragmented political structure of medieval Europe made it easy for these atrocities to happen.
And finally, there's the role of propaganda. Leaders like Peter the Hermit stirred up crowds with fiery sermons, painting Jews as enemies of the faith who were hoarding wealth and plotting against Christians. These kinds of speeches fueled the mob's anger and provided a thin veneer of justification for their actions.
So, when you combine centuries of antisemitism, economic resentment, religious zealotry, mob mentality, and weak political authority, you get a perfect storm. The Rhineland Massacres weren't an anomaly, they were the result of deeply rooted societal issues that exploded in the chaos of the People's Crusade.
And tragically, this pattern of scapegoating and violence against Jewish communities would repeat itself throughout European history. The Rhineland Massacres were one of the earliest large-scale examples of what we now call pogroms, but they were far from the last.
Understanding these deeper causes isn't just about analyzing the past, it's about recognizing the warning signs in the present. History may not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes, and we need to pay attention to those echoes. The Rhineland Massacres of 1096 are a harrowing chapter in history, and their legacy is both profound and far-reaching. These events weren't just isolated atrocities, they set the stage for centuries of persecution and tension between Jewish and Christian communities in Europe.
Let's start with the immediate impact. The massacres effectively wiped out some of the most vibrant and prosperous Jewish communities in the Rhineland. Cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz had been major centers of Jewish culture, trade, and scholarship, but after the massacres, these communities were decimated. Survivors were left to rebuild in the shadow of unimaginable trauma, and many were forced to flee.
Those who fled often moved eastward, towards Central and Eastern Europe. Over the next few centuries, Jewish communities would establish themselves in regions like Poland, Bohemia, and Hungary, where they found slightly more tolerance, at least for a time. These migrations helped shape the Jewish diaspora in Europe, but they were born out of desperation, not choice.
And let's not overlook the psychological toll. Jewish chroniclers of the time described the massacres with words of despair, lamentation, and defiance. For Jewish communities, the Rhineland massacres were a catastrophic loss, but also a testament to their resilience. Many chose death over forced conversion, and their stories became part of the collective memory of Jewish resistance and faith.
On a broader scale, the massacres deepened the divide between Christians and Jews in Europe. The violence of 1096 wasn't an isolated event, it set a grim precedent. Over the centuries, Jewish communities would face repeated cycles of persecution, including expulsions, pogroms, and accusations like the blood libel.
In a way, the Rhineland massacres became a template for anti-Semitic violence in Europe. The same toxic combination of religious justification, economic envy, and mob mentality that fueled the massacres would reappear again and again. We see echoes of it in events like the Spanish Inquisition, the expulsions of Jews from England and France, and, tragically, the Holocaust many centuries later.
But the legacy of the Rhineland massacres isn't just about the continuation of antisemitism, it's also a warning about the dangers of unchecked religious extremism and mob violence. These massacres remind us of what can happen when rhetoric turns into action, and when communities fail to protect their most vulnerable members.
Another key lesson is the failure of leadership. In many of the Rhineland cities, local bishops and rulers tried to intervene, but their efforts were either half-hearted or overwhelmed by the sheer size of the Crusader mobs. The massacres show what happens when leaders either lack the will or the resources to stand up to hatred.
And let's talk about the Crusades themselves. While the official Crusades were primarily focused on Jerusalem and the Holy Land, the Rhineland massacres highlight how the crusading movement could spiral out of control. What began as a call to reclaim a distant city turned into a license for violence against anyone deemed the other, even within Europe itself.
Exactly. The Crusades are often romanticized in popular culture as noble quests or epic adventures, but the Rhineland massacres force us to confront the darker side of that story. They reveal the human cost of religious zealotry and the dangers of dehumanizing those who believe differently.
But there's also a lesson about resilience. Despite the trauma of the massacres, Jewish communities continued to endure and adapt. They rebuilt their lives, preserved their traditions, and found ways to thrive in new environments. Their survival is a testament to the strength of their culture and faith.
And on a more hopeful note, studying events like the Rhineland massacres can help us identify patterns of hate and violence before they escalate. Understanding the past doesn't just help us remember, it equips us to act.
That's a powerful takeaway. The Rhineland massacres are a dark chapter, but they're also a call to vigilance.
At the same time, they're a reminder of the importance of empathy and solidarity. When we look back on these events, we see the consequences of division, but also the potential for unity if people choose compassion over fear.
So, the legacy of the Rhineland massacres is twofold. On the one hand, it's a cautionary tale about the worst of human behavior. On the other, it's a testament to resilience and the enduring power of community and faith.
It's a heavy lesson, but one we can't afford to ignore. By confronting the past, we give ourselves a better chance of shaping a future where history doesn't repeat itself.
Well said, Marco. Let's carry that lesson forward, and let's remember that understanding history isn't just about looking back, it's about building a better tomorrow. So, what can we take away from the Rhineland Massacres of 1096? First, it's a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred and mob mentality.
And second, it underscores the importance of protecting vulnerable communities. The Crusaders saw themselves as doing God's work, but in reality, they were perpetrating one of history's great atrocities.
History isn't always pretty, but it's important. That's why we're here, to shine a light on these moments so they're never forgotten.
Thanks for joining us today, folks. If you learned something, or even if you just appreciated our attempt to tackle this tough topic, please consider leaving us a 5-star review.
Those reviews really help the podcast grow and reach more listeners. And don't forget to subscribe, share with your history-loving friends, and check out our merch in the show notes.
Got a topic you want us to cover? Hit us up on social media. We love hearing your suggestions.
That's it for today's episode of the History AI Podcast. Thanks for listening, and as always, stay curious. Discover the dark, enchanting world of shadowed journeys, the tales of Jordan and Squishy. Follow Jordan, a seemingly innocent girl with a hidden power, and her loyal companion Squishy, who reincarnates into different animals after each battle. Venture into the ominous depths of the Whispering Woods as they face fierce creatures and uncover ancient secrets. Will Jordan succumb to the darkness within, or will she find the strength to forge a new destiny? Perfect for fans of dark fantasy and epic quests, this spellbinding tale will captivate and leave you pondering the fine line between hero and villain. Dive into Shadowed Journeys today. Available on Amazon now.